Ontario universities and colleges eagerly recruit international students in every field and discipline. But especially during this pandemic, some of those keen students have ended up facing real crises with limited or no supports once they get here. With us to explain what's happening in Brampton, Ontario, Manvir Bhangu, founder of the South Asian gender equality-focused nonprofit Ladlian. In Mississauga, Ontario, Simran Dhunna, a member of the Najawan Support Network Collective, and Uday Rana, reporter with the Global Mail. Hi to you all.
Nice to be here.
Hi, Nam.
Uday, I wanted to start with you. You worked on an investigation for the Globe about the exploitation of Indian international students. How did you come to report on this story?
Well, let me preface this by saying that within the South Asian community, there is a broader understanding of what the international student experience is, because many immigrants right now have been students at one point or the other. Many of them have. So they understand that this isn't an easy life to lead, to go through your student life and be on that path to permanent residency. But we found that the broader Canadian public didn't really understand what the international student experience meant. Who are these students? Where do they come from? What are their experiences? And why do they come to Canada? And when they come here, what are the kind of challenges that they face? And we found that there really was not a lot of education on what makes the life of an international student so difficult. And we really wanted to sort of shine a light on this aspect of higher education in Canada.
You know, and as a reporter, you're meant to keep your distance from the story. But did this story surprise you? Did it shock you?
It did, to a very large extent, because, you know, there were, of course, certain stereotypes that we know not to be true. The fact that we know for a fact that a lot of these students don't come from very wealthy backgrounds. A lot of these students don't come from backgrounds that are, you know, easily able to support their life in a country as expensive as Canada. But what really shocked me was just the level to which they, you know, some of them have to make sacrifices. I asked some students what they ate for breakfast, and it surprised me to find that one of the most popular things that many students consumed was a cup of Tim Hortons French vanilla coffee, which means that that's breakfast. So, you know, they're skipping breakfast. There's a large degree of food insecurity, and that's just a small example of the kind of financial stress that some of these students are facing, because the tuition fees that they pay is exorbitant. The living expenses are too high, and you know, they don't earn a lot of money working part-time jobs.
We're going to get into more into those issues in a little bit. But Simran, why is Canada one of the top countries international students choose for immigration?
Yeah, so back home in India and Punjab, everyone is told Canada is a paradise, that it's easy to get PR here, it's a safe and fair society where you can settle down and live with dignity. But there's an entire industry that's set up by Canada and India to sell this image. And back home, a lot of youth are also facing extreme levels of unemployment, precarity. So of course, when you hear that story, you choose to come to Canada. The truth is, when people come here, it's a deeply isolating and exploitative experience. And at its core, Canada wants international students here in ever-increasing numbers because they're cheap labor and good business. And that's why that exploitation is given a green light.
Uday mentioned the tuition fees, and I just wanted to go over that. So over the last 7 years, tuition for international students has skyrocketed, while fees for domestic students have remained steady. Let's take a look at this chart by Statistics Canada and the Global Mail that details Canadian and international tuition fees by level of study in Ontario. In 2013, Canadian undergraduates paid an average of $7,257. In 2021, their tuition costs were $7,938. Conversely, the tuition of international undergraduates in 2013 was $23,688. In 2021, it was pegged at a whopping $42,185, which is just that number, just like when you compare it to what undergraduates here are paying, it's just an astronomical number. Uday, what's your response? And I know you kind of mentioned it a little bit, because I think there's this perception that if students can come to Canada to travel, that somehow that they're very wealthy. How do you respond to that stereotype?
Well, the kind of students that I've spoken to are children of farmers, the children of government employees back in India. Many of them have had to sell their lands and have had to take on huge amounts of debt to send their kids off to Canada. So really, when they come here to Canada, they're already financially stressed, and then keeping up with living expenses and paying tuition fees really adds to that stress. Um, and just to add to what Simran was saying earlier, I think what has ended up happening over the last few years, which has made Canada such a destination for international students, is that the economic distress in India and Canada's need for a younger workforce have sort of coincided. So there is a need to desperately get out of India as soon as possible. And the kind of economic stress that they go through to send their kids to Canada really puts the financial stress on them. And one of the requirements of your student permit in Canada is that you cannot work for more than 20 hours a week. So even though you have all of these financial stresses, and a lot of them, because their families have undertaken such huge debt, have this moral obligation to sort of send money back home, or a moral obligation that they put on themselves to send money back home. Along with your tuition and along with keeping up expenses in a country as expensive as Canada, really puts a lot of financial stress on some of these students who don't come from very affluent backgrounds to begin with. Like I said, the children of farmers, the children of government employees, the children of middle school teachers. And they're really coming here to have a better life that they didn't really foresee happening in India.
And Manvir, on top of all those pressures, you also have to get good grades, right? You have that expectation to be able to finish your courses. You work with South Asian international students through your nonprofit organization. What are the most common reasons that students come when they're looking for help?
So in my organization in Ladliyan, we support a lot of South Asian girls and women. And to be honest, international students was not a population that we were serving before the pandemic, just because we didn't really see the needs that there were. But unfortunately, during the pandemic, it was brought to our attention that a lot of young women who are here as international students are facing so many different challenges, from sexual health issues to mental health issues to living in overcrowded housing to being victims of sexual assault, not knowing their rights. And obviously, there's exploitation from employers and from landlords as well. So those are the kinds of things that we started to see and were brought to our attention during early 2020. And ever since then, we have been supporting international students and female international students with a variety of supports that they need.
And it seems that international students seem to be in this kind of like gray area, right? They're here, they're paid the tuition, but they don't really have many places to look for support. For example, they might not be able to sign a lease, but they can rent a room. What kind of abusive housing situations are international students dealing with?
I think exactly what you just mentioned, right? Like housing, which is just such a necessity, but is so hard for them to come by, is one of the most common ones that we see. We actually had a student in early 2020 who was staying in a garage. And, this garage was not by any means insulated or, appropriate to be living in, to be sleeping in. But this student was given this garage for $500 a month and was sharing the kitchen and the bathroom with the basement folks in that house. And, she had no other choice. And, we were trying to look for a room for her, but it's just so hard to find appropriate housing for these women. And a lot of them are actually living in such overcrowded housing that when the pandemic started, they were struggling with something as simple as internet. They didn't have adequate internet to do their work because there's just so many people now stuck at home doing work from home, but they just don't, like, the landlord doesn't care about bandwidth issues or increasing capacity of internet so that these students can get their work done and hand in those assignments and get the grades that they need. And even things like technology, we saw people were sharing laptops, people were sharing cell phones, and just then waiting for their turn to use that laptop to submit their assignments. So otherwise they would have had access to libraries and things like that. But these were not issues that were considered or that were even they weren't addressed when the pandemic started for international students, and landlords really couldn't care less.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you said that, because I know that if we, as Canadian citizens, if something comes up and someone is trying to take advantage of you, i.e. a landlord, you can go to different organizations for help. You can file a police report. Were any police reports filed during this period, Manvir?
No, I mean, I don't think so. We try to educate the students that come through our doors around their legal rights. And even though they're international students, they still have rights and they still have responsibilities. But there's such a fear of deportation when it comes to the international student population. Although they're here legally, although they have their paperwork, especially the women, like they believe that they will be deported if they do anything that is against, what their landlord is saying or what their employer is saying. And we're just trying to educate that that is not the case. Unless you are here illegally, then yes, that may be a possibility. But you came here with all the right paperwork and all of your documentation. You're enrolled in your program. You're working hard. Unfortunately, as Uday mentioned as well, a lot of them are working cash jobs because they simply can't they just can't make their payments. They can't survive on 21 hours or 20 hours a week of work. But I think they've kind of believed, and they're so fearful of being deported if they don't follow the strict guidelines that their employers or that their landlords have in place for them. And a lot of them have become victims to that.
I want to follow up on what you said, Manvir, with Uday. You mentioned that these students can only work 20 hours a week. What are some of the employment issues that they're facing?
Well, there's the fact that 20 hours a week is simply not enough for them to keep up with not just tuition, but also the fact that many of them have to send money back home. It's an obligation that they've taken on themselves. And, it doesn't help. I just also want to circle back to what Manvir was saying about housing discrimination. If you are an international student looking for accommodation in the GTA, it's really slim pickings for you. That's just the sad fact of house hunting as an international student in the GTA, because there are landlords, even South Asian landlords, who will straight up deny you housing because you are on a student permit. I have had many international students tell me that they've been through this exact experience. Then, you have landlords telling you that, yes, you can live here, but you can't cook Indian food, or you can't, have guests over, or you don't have a sense of privacy. So really, they end up sacrificing a lot just because there are no options for them to live in a decent accommodation. So they end up living in people's basements where there are very intrusive landlords. They end up living in situations where they can't cook Indian food, which really contributes to a lot of the food insecurity that they already face. And on top of that, you've got the fact that they only work 20 hours a week, so they can't really make enough money to get fresh groceries on the regular. They have to settle for cheap fast food, and really all of this contributes to this notion of food insecurity among international students. This is a real problem that's really catching up.
It just feels as if every moment of the day is filled with some kind of stress. We have a clip from a recent rally protesting wage theft led by Naujawan Support Network outside Chat Hut on December 4th. Sheldon, could you please roll the clip?
आपदे जन्मदिन आपदे दिन त्यार सारे मैं इन्ना दे नाल बिना छुट्टी कड्डे आ 2 ਵਾਰ मैं बीमार होई आ 1 ਵਾਰ मैं 45 घंटे इत्थे इन्हां दे वाशरूम च गिरी रही किसे नूं पता भी नहीं सी कि मैं वाशरूम दे विच गिरी होई आ ਜਦੋਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਸਾਰਾ ਬੈਗ ਚੈੱਕ ਕੀਤੀ ਫਿਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਵਾਸ਼ਰੂਮ 'ਚ ਗਿਰੀ ਹੋਈ ਆ ਚਲੋ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਘਰ ਭੇਜਤਾ ਸੈਕਿੰਡ ਟਾਈਮ ਮੈਂ ਇੱਥੇ 2.5 ਘੰਟੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਕਾਊਂਟਰ ਦੇ ਪਿੱਛੇ ਗਿਰੀ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਕੋਈ ਕਸਟਮਰ ਆ ਕੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਰਿਹਾ ਵੀ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਕੁੜੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਗਿਰੀ ਪਈ ਆ ਫਿਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਘਰੇ ਛੱਡਿਆ ਤੇ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ 5 ਦਿਨ ਦੀ ਛੁੱਟੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੇਰੀ ਛੁੱਟੀ ਅਪਰੂਵ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਮੈਨੂੰ 5 ਦਿਨ ਸੱਦਿਆ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਰੈਸਟੋਰੈਂਟ ਬਿਜ਼ੀ ਸੀ
I mean, just listening to what she was saying, that, one time she fainted, she was on the ground for 45 minutes and no one noticed. Another time for 2.5 hours and the customer is saying, your employee is on the ground. Simran, what are some other cases of wage theft that you've supported international students with recently?
Satinder's case is really very common. A lot of international students will hear that and empathize because they've experienced it themselves. And I just want to note, with her case in particular, she was paid below the minimum wage. At the beginning, $5 an hour, and later on increased to $8 an hour. And
how can this happen? How can this happen?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In this case, and with many, immigration status is a huge driving factor that gives employers kind of the green light to exploit workers. So Jat had, in this case, had promised Satinder they would help her with her PR application. And when Satinder finally received her work permit and demanded that she be paid minimum wage on payroll, and get support with PR, they denied her both. In fact, they told her, we'll only help you with PR if you work another year below the minimum wage.
That's permanent residency, right? PR?
Yes, that's correct. And so she left the job after that, and she was on the brink of suicide, overcame that, but she found out that there's another way to fight for her rights, and she approached us, and we organized a campaign to recover the nearly $18,000 in wages that she's owed.
Oh, $18,000. You mentioned contemplating suicide. Manvir, what are some barriers to seeking mental health support?
I mean, there's so many. One of the things that we see is just, firstly, the language. And not a lot of mainstream organizations are currently supporting international students for the simple reason that they can't report these students as a stat when they report back to their funders. And that is not something that students are thinking about when they go access support. They don't want to be told that, no, you can't be helped here because we literally can't put you down as a number for our stats. Another barrier I know for international students who identify as female is just like lack of education and awareness around what they're entitled to and where they can go to for support. A lot of these young women don't have access to cars, they don't have access to vehicles or rides, so they are using public transportation, which is even creating more barriers for them. You'll see that a lot of the young men who are here may have a car versus the young women that are here, and they don't really know where to go and how to go get that support. Also keeping in mind that a lot of them, this is the first time they've stepped away from their family setting and are away and alone for the first time, and aren't so savvy or aren't so bold or confident to go out and access support. So they suffer in silence. And one of the beauties about the organization that we have is, we are supporting these young women by speaking their language. Our doors are open and we look like them, and we belong to the same cultural background, and we're not saying no to them just because we can't report them as a stat. So we found ways to support them in ways that that they need, and something as simple as they don't know where to go buy menstrual hygiene products, and that is it blows our mind, and it just they don't know who to ask. They don't know, where to access these products. They don't know what the student center in their college can do for them because they've never accessed these kind of supports back home. And this is all very new and foreign to them. And frankly, I don't think colleges are as prepared as they need to be to support these students as they're entering. The orientation that colleges do is very generic. It's not specific to international student populations. It's the generic orientations that they're doing for all students, but the needs of students is very different depending on where they're coming from and what they're coming here for.
I'm just thinking of the pressure too. It will be very difficult for you to call back home and say this is happening when your family has already sacrificed so much for you to have the opportunity to be in this country to learning. Simran, Manvir talked about kind of like the one-size-fits-all that colleges do when they're doing the orientation. What targeted efforts are needed to address the number of suicides we're seeing in the community?
Yeah, so absolutely. It's a really good question. And certainly the level of suicide and the premature death we're seeing among international students is really concerning. And a lot of the reasons for depression and suicide is because of the isolation people face here. But insofar as that, suicide and depression is a result of hopelessness, the aim of our group is to give people hope that there's actually an avenue for you to resolve your problems together. And that's why we encourage people to reach out. And if they're ready to fight for their rights, whether it's against their employer, their landlord, they want to do a campaign, they want to come forward, we'll stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and we'll educate each other about our rights and organize. And that's really just the best way to ensure that, at least insofar as people feel hopeless about options, they know that they have rights here.
And Manvir, is sexual trafficking another issue that's happening right now?
Definitely. I think, just sexual trafficking, human trafficking, and just a lot of actually sexual assault that's happening within the international student population, particularly the female population, is something that we can't even begin to explore because there's just not enough capacity currently with the organizations that are supporting these populations. And it is very hard to get women to openly talk about it and want to come forward simply because, again, that deportation fear is there, and just sex in general is a very taboo topic within the South Asian community, within the Punjabi community. And, these women are experiencing so many things that they are not willing to address, and out of fear, out of the stigma that's involved, and want to confide in us only if we are able to keep that to ourselves. And there's really not much we can do without their consent or without their permission to help them further. But it's something that is, we need a whole task force around that. We don't have the capacity within smaller organizations to go out and fight for that with them or for them without the resources that we need to take that step.
What do you think the government should be doing?
I think the government really needs to reassess, this. They really need to reassess why these students are coming and be prepared for that. What's shocking is that during the pandemic, there was not one instance where international students were not coming in. And that was like mind-boggling, because we're telling everybody to stop traveling, to stop going overseas, but we're taking in, so many international students, and we're clearly not prepared to welcome them. We're not prepared to help them settle. We know that settlement agencies can't really be of use to these students, and we don't know where they're going to stay. We don't know who's going to take care of them. We don't know if they know anything about their community that they're going to be coming to settle in. And I think governments really need to understand that beyond, making money off of these students, they have a responsibility, because these are humans. And a lot of them are, like Simran mentioned, they're committing suicide because they just don't know how to deal with the stresses of coming here. And for those organizations that are supporting them, we just don't have enough resources, enough money to support them. And I mean, I think even the work that Simran's team does, it's very recent, but you can see that how needed it is because of the traction that it's built in just such a short time. And there's so many students who need that support. But again, we just can't have 2 or 3 organizations doing that work in serving such a large population.
And I'm guessing too, if you go to school in the GTHA, it's probably a very different experience if you are outside, and maybe it makes it even harder for these students to access community sports. Simran, are students outside of the GTA more limited in accessing community supports and services?
Yeah, absolutely. Before NSN, actually, in the GTA, there was no other kind of group of self-organized international students and workers confronting those who exploit us. And since we've started, we've received tons of calls, messages from people in other cities, provinces, even countries as far as Australia, people saying we're experiencing the exact same thing. So one of our goals is to actually support other international students and workers in those regions to organize a similar type of initiative and to stop the exploitation where they are. We've learned a lot in the last 7 months, and we're keen to share those learnings with other people who want to fight for their rights.
I asked this question already. I want to ask it to Uday and Simran. What can universities and governments do to address the lack of infrastructure needed to support international students? Uday, I'll start with you.
So I think something that isn't spoken about enough is the profound loneliness that comes with being an international student. I spoke to the father of Lovepreet Singh, who died by suicide last year, and that was really one of the suicides that shocked the student community, in the GTA. And I spoke to his father about, what his son was going through, and he said, I had no idea. I have no idea what he was going through. I have no idea what his life was like. I suddenly wake up one day to learn that my son has died by suicide. And I think that really speaks to the fact that many of these students don't feel heard. Many of these students are not able to access any mental health services that are on offer because of a language barrier or because of a cultural barrier. And I think they are not getting the kind of support that they thought they would get from older immigrant communities in the GTA. Brampton, for example, has a very significant South Asian population, but many students I spoke to don't feel supported by older immigrants who often tell them, this is a rite of passage. You have to go through this. This is a rough patch, and they kind of ask them to, tide it over with this whole idea of, okay, just stay positive. You have to get through this, and this is why there was a vacuum in terms of having that kind of community solidarity and kind of community support where organizations like NSN and Ladliya had to step in because many students didn't feel supported by those older immigrants. So I think what's needed, and a lot of students will tell you this, is to foster that sense of community, foster that sense of solidarity, but also create ecosystems within these institutions where students feel heard. Because a lot of these students are saying, we pay exorbitant amounts, we pay tens of thousands of dollars. So are we cash cows for these universities and colleges? Are we just here to pay money Do they just want us for the money that we bring in and not for our humanity, not for who we are? And I think that's a question that universities and colleges across Ontario, but really across the entire country, are going to have to answer now.
And Simran?
Yeah, Uday is very on point. And I think in order to actually answer the question, what can governments do? We have to also ask, what have governments been doing to stop things like wage theft that students and workers are facing? The answer for that is very, very little. Workers in our group have actually approached politicians regarding their stolen wages, and they'll just say, go through the legal system, a system that takes months to process claims and leaves employers with many loopholes. We've also approached the Ministry of Labor, asking them why they're not imposing serious consequences on employers found to be wage thieves. You know, people don't know that we have laws in Ontario that allow the government to heavily fine and prosecute wage thieves. And that has never been done. So all the ministry does is issue orders to pay, and employers can gleefully tell their workers, go ahead, file a claim. And so there's a lot of mechanisms through which employers act with impunity. Students are left in the lurch. The 20-hour policy previously alluded to really tells us that governments aren't here to look after us and our interests, and we can really only look after one another. We are the best defense against exploitation, and if we are united, we are a deterrent to wage theft. And I just briefly want to touch a point that they mentioned about older immigrants. I think there are definitely people in our community who aren't coming out to support students, but there's also a history that we can draw upon of Punjabi immigrants who came in the 70s, fought against the acute racism they faced in the workplace and neighborhoods, and they organized to defend themselves against that. And some of those elders are actually showing up to our protests now. So this is a struggle. This is a movement that's very intergenerational and that has to rely on solidarity from people within our community as well as people outside of our community. In fact, at our Jod Hut rally, the video that you showed, there were people present from other organizations of working class people, Parkdale Organized, Gig Workers United, Migrant Students United, Ontario Federation of Labor. You know, those are the people that helped us to take the streets, confront this employer. And that's where our strength ultimately lies, by making sure that there are consequences on the people who exploit us. And as a result, also giving hope to students that there's another way to assert your rights.
I want to thank you, the three of you, for being on the show with us tonight. I know this is a very difficult thing to talk about, but thank you for ringing the alarm and for sharing your insights. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.